guys still up? Excited? All right. Okay, so this is all about red and blue teaming. I just out of curiosity, how many people are 100% dedicated to security in the room? Okay, and how many of those are blue team versus red team? So the offensive side versus the defensive side. So blue team, and then red team. Yeah, see, look, that's a bad number, right? We should have a mix of both. But anyways, this is all about elevating our capabilities. I'm a big believer that we've been stuck with commodity-based controls. And what I mean by commodity-based controls, I'm talking about IPs, SHAs, domains, URLs, right? We buy a product, we defend a bit against them using those types of capabilities, but they're easily evaded by the adversary. And I really do believe that we need to climb that ladder. And this is really where we're going in this discussion today. So first and foremost, doesn't matter the vendor you're with, all protections fail. They will fail at some point. You'll never get 100% efficacy 100% of the time, period. End of state. We'll talk a little bit about the teams for those that may not be as familiar with some of the teams. We'll talk about what is breach attack simulation and tools, and then I'll go through a couple of examples. So the disclaimer is this: I have access to stuff, and so I've used Caldera, which is an open source technology, for one example of breach attack simulation. The other is a commercial product called Attack IQ. I have nothing to do with Attack IQ, but it gives you a perspective of both on how that tool works. And then I've got, how do I test it? Well, I got to test it against some type of control, and I am at Cisco, so I happen to use Cisco. But you use any technology that you have. This is not a Cisco thing. This is really about a defensive thing, right? Really, truly understanding it. So all protections fail. This is where we kind of land, right? Everybody does this. We've got, workstations or endpoints that we've got some type of agent installed on them, right? EPP at the least, right? Endpoint protection. And then you move to endpoint detection and response, maybe some advanced capabilities, hopefully that you're there today. But there's other things on the network that you can't install an agent on. So you can't depend on that control 100% of the time for everything, and nor can you depend on it because it will fail. So you have to assume that it will fail at some point in time. And if you're lucky enough, you might have things within the network that provide visibility. So for example, Billy's talking like this today, and all of a sudden he starts going like this. He does that a lot if you know him, right? But he's starting to scan the whole layer 2 network. And can you detect that? Well, you might say, yes, I have an endpoint product that can maybe catch that. But if that fails, you might say, yes, I have a networking component. But it is all about those layers. And then you've got workloads, right, or servers. Those servers are going to have control points put on them as well. Maybe endpoint protection, maybe some type of application layer control. Doesn't matter, right? It could be cloud or on-premise, but you're going to have some controls there. But what happens is the adversary gets in. We see this time and time again, right? And you might think, you know what, I've got lots of pieces. Maybe they operate and integrate well, but we still seem to fail. And we read it not even weekly. Like every 2 days, there's a big one, right? And so what happens is they get on one asset and they continue to move within the organization, and then eventually, it's game over, right? We end up failing. But in order for the adversary to do all of these things, there's stuff that has to happen in their favor, right? There's certain things that they have to do. And maybe if we focus on those layers, I'm not saying dismiss the commodity-based controls, but maybe if we truly understand how the adversary may act within our organization, maybe then we can identify the areas of opportunity to mitigate risk. And so there's some things around MITRE ATT&CK framework that we can certainly elevate our capabilities and understand the tactics, the techniques, and the procedures that the adversary is going to leverage in order to be successful. So we don't want this. None of us want this. And it's interesting, recently I think a casino paid $15 million, not for the keys to unlock the ransomware, but I think it was just solely so the data wouldn't get released to the public, right? Pretty good paycheck. So my point is that we can look for areas. If they're moving laterally within the environment and we're scared that we might get compromised, maybe we should understand that and maybe prevent the ability for the adversary to move laterally within the organization, or put a lot of detection and prevention capabilities in place to minimize our risk. And there's nuance when you start talking about MITRE attack, right? There's nuance in the way that you have the ability either to prevent or detect. Some things you may not be able to prevent 100% of the time. For example, if they leverage PowerShell within the organization and you need PowerShell for other things and you can't restrict its access for some reason, then that might be acceptable risk there to say we need that in place. The adversary may use it, but we want tooling that would detect an adversary taking advantage of it because we can't turn it off. So the goal here is really to start moving towards threat-informed defense. And I really do believe this buys us two things as defenders specifically. One is the first thing that it does is that if we make it difficult for the adversary to be successful, they have to create more noise. And if they create more noise, that gives my other tooling a chance to detect their presence in the environment. And it also buys what I believe is time-based defense. It gives me time if I make it difficult for them to be successful. And again, that gives me an opportunity to detect them in the environment. So everyone hopefully is familiar with the pyramid of pain. And if you're not, certainly look it up. But the pyramid of pain kind of, the whole goal around that is to suggest the pain invoked on the adversary if I have these indicators in place to make it difficult for the adversary to be successful. So the bottom three, domains, hashes, and IP addresses, are typically a symptom, and they're pretty trivial for the adversary to overcome. For example, if you have an IP address and you have a technology stack that says, oh, I'm going to block that IP, the adversary just needs to change it. And guess what? They bypass your control. Same thing with a domain, same thing with a file. We want to move up higher in the stack, and we want to get up to where we think it's very difficult for the adversary to overcome, and that's tactics, techniques, and procedures, so TTP. And MITRE is a great tool to allow us to evaluate our organization. I talked about this last year. I'd be curious to see how many people move forward with it, but really do a gap analysis of what we identify as the adversary that targets our vertical, and these are real-world examples. These aren't pie-in-the-sky stuff. These are things that happen with research paper supporting it. So we know how they act, and then addressing that with the defensive capabilities where we can, and then identifying the gaps that remain. So if you're not familiar with MITRE, they've been around for a long time. You might be more familiar with Common Vulnerability Exposure Database. These are the folks, right? They created the attack framework in 2013, and it really focuses on the adversary's perspective, the who, their goals, the why, and the methods, the how. And ultimately, if you understand this, you can really truly start building a defensive posture that makes it difficult. Does that mean you're going to be 100% immune to every threat? No, absolutely not. But it's going to buy you the time needed, hopefully, to prevent bad from happening. So I'm not suggesting that those lower, what I call commodity-based controls, are no longer important. We still need to do that. It gets rid of a lot of noise. So we want to make sure that we continue to do that. And then continue to rise up that stack and get to TTPs. Really understand the adversary. I'll get more in this in a moment. You need to understand the adversaries, right? And like I said, there's nuance in our ability to not only prevent, but also detect, right? And then breach attack simulation, which we're really more focused on today, is again elevating our understanding of how the adversary operates, and then testing our controls and seeing what the outcomes look like. And maybe we identify a gap that we can address. You're not going to address every single gap, but maybe we identify a gap that we can address. But some of the things that you get out of it is the teams actually acted as the adversary and defended against that adversary, so they've seen it, been there. So if it does happen, it's not new to you, right? You've been living and breathing that. And so there's really two teams, and I'll go pretty quick here, but blue team's the defense side, right? They're the ones that defend the organization against cyber attack, right? They're the ones that build up that security posture. Then you leverage certain toolkits from vendors, right? Build it and piece it all together. That's a whole other story, right? But that builds your defensive posture. And there's people and process that should be part of this equation as well. It's not just technology. It's all about risk reduction. Hopefully you got some orchestration and automation. in place as well. They augment all aspects of defense, right? Machine learning and artificial intelligence. Again, I'm almost thinking it's interesting how this AI, there's certain terms out there that become more marketing than actually like value, right? And one of them, zero trust, machine learning, AI, right? But AI can provide us a tremendous opportunity, right? Good data set, and we can drive specific outcomes. But I'm not a big believer in those marketing terms, right? Zero trust is a framework, not a product. So some of their activities, user and device monitoring, network cloud, workload application, network detection and response, endpoint detection and response, vulnerability management, and it goes on, right? Patch management, incident response, forensics, and security operations management, and awareness training. Then you got the red team. These are the offensive side. And we've typically, they've operated a little bit in silos, and that's where purple teams come in, and I'll talk about that in a second. But they assess the security posture, right? Hopefully simulating real-world attacks, things that the adversary are going to do, and they're going to leverage all kinds of techniques, methodologies to identify those weaknesses, and then they're going to create a report at the end to say, hey, look, we're able to successfully do X, right? And hopefully the defensive team, the blue team, takes that and start building the defensive capabilities in the organization. And so things like vulnerability scanning, pen testing, social engineering, physical security, wireless network testing, application security, exploit development, and breach attack simulation. It's interesting because you got USB keys. I don't know if you know, right? And you know what? They know everybody here is not going to plug that in. But guess who is? Anybody with kids, right? They're going to find it and plug it in for us. Or I mean the organizers. But anyways, just a little fun on the USB key. But threat intelligence research as well. Purple teams is not a new team. It's actually two teams coming together. And there's no secrets here, right? We're sharing intelligence across both teams. You're going to know what I'm going to do, and I know the defensive posture that you have. The goal in this is really to start identifying gaps within the organization. It aligns to the business, collaborate between the two teams, improve the overall security posture of the organization is the ultimate goal, right? So understanding the adversaries by leveraging cyber threat intelligence. You want to emulate the tactics, techniques, and procedures. You want to identify and remediate those gaps during the emulation process as well. Anybody do breach attack simulation? I'm just curious. Yeah? Kinda? Not now.
We're starting it with Caldera, which is
Yeah, so Caldera actually, if you haven't played with Caldera, very easy to deploy in your own home lab. You can actually certify. I don't even think there's any cost to certify. You just go through and you capture a bunch of flags, you submit it, and you get a certification on blue and red. I think both sides, I think. But anyways, yeah, so it's open source, and it's actually created by Maynard. So certainly leverage that. I'm glad to see that you're even exploring it. So this is a good thing, and I do believe we all need to get to this level, right? I'm not saying that you have to build this in-house. Maybe you just once a year or twice a year or something like that, you bring in somebody to do this or work together with somebody. But I do think that we need to change the way that we defend our organizations. And so the cyber kill chain, there's certain things that have to take place, right? Reconnaissance, right? What are the IPs that I'm targeting? And some of this I can and can't control, right? If I can find your public IP block on the internet, how do you hide that from me? Can't, right? Can't do anything. If I'm creating an exploit to target a vulnerability that happens to be on your system, how do you stop me? You can't. I can do that all day, every day. Well, I mean, you could patch the system, but you're not gonna, right? Weaponization, delivery, exploitation, installation, command and control, and then actions on objectives. Now, I've heard people say it the other way, but I do believe the adversary has to be right every step of the way here in order to compromise your environment. A defender only has to be right in one of them. Now, a good adversary might have 3 or 4 ways to accomplish a task, right? But if I can stop, say, weaponization or delivery, right? If I can stop the delivery, then how do you move forward as an adversary? Right? If I'm not going to click something, nobody's going to click anything, right? And nobody's using USBs handed out at a conference. How do I get that payload into the organization? Now, stopping it 100% of the time is a whole other ballgame, right? But there's mechanisms or tactics and techniques that they're going to do to deliver that payload. If I can prevent that, then they're not going to do exploitation, installation, command and controls, and actions on objectives, right? They need those other pieces to fall in line. So I do believe defenders have the greatest opportunity. It's just tough. So a little bit about breach attack simulation, right? It provides a testing methodology to simulate attacks against the organization. It helps identify any weaknesses and vulnerabilities across the entire attack vectors that may exist and exploited by the adversary. We want to determine the security effectiveness and the opportunities to close those gaps in people and process and technology, not just the technology side, right? There's an opportunity to say, how would we go and move this through the incident response life cycle, as an example, right? And then reconnaissance. So if you break this down, there's certain things that are going to happen. For example, reconnaissance, right? They want to figure out and locate the opportunities within the environment. Then you're going to do some scanning of those systems to find out where those weaknesses exist and then eventually exploit them, right? So reconnaissance, you've got vulnerability scanning and then exploitation that takes place. Privilege escalation, moving from, maybe a standard-based user into a privileged user that I have full access to the system, maybe then dump memory to harvest credentials as an example. And then really, once I land on a system and get access, what do I need to do next? Is it it? Did I win the game as the adversary? No. I've now got to, guess what? Poke and prod and figure out my next move. So that life cycle almost starts over again, right? They're scanning the network. They're looking for weaknesses. They're trying to find an exploit that they could leverage to take advantage of that vulnerability. So they're making a lot of noise. They're not doing this stealth. They might be do this as slow and low as possible. But they're there making noise. We just got to figure out where that noise is and make sense of it. And then data exfiltration. Once I get into an organization and I start harvesting data, what do I typically do with that data? Do I just send it from that machine, that machine, that machine, that machine, that machine out to my system in the back end or box or wherever I'm dumping that data to? Do I just do that? Or do I have a central system with enough capacity, slowly move the data into a central system, and then slowly leak it out of the organization over time? Probably. And then reporting, right? You're going to have some reporting at the end of this. So think of it this way. We got reconnaissance, initial access, execution. These are all tactics an adversary might leverage. And then privilege escalation. So we popped a box. Not a big deal, because if I can scope or minimize the overall scope of that attack, then the adversary has very limited options to move around in the organization. Then lateral movement takes place. I need the network in order to drive that outcome. I can't do it any other way. There's no secret way of doing it. The network's going to get some activity. Can I detect it? That's a whole other ballgame. And then you have maybe data exfiltration, privilege escalation on other systems. So again, they're just making noise all along that path. And these are all based on identifiers. I like to call them T identifiers. I don't know if that's formally what they're called. But they're T identifiers. They also have the software identifiers, so S identifier, or mitigations, so M identifiers. And so that means that we're all talking the same language. There's no confusion. When I say TA0043, whether you know it's reconnaissance or not, when you look it up, you're going to know it's reconnaissance. So there's no mistake here. So some of the tooling, as I mentioned, right? There's a variety of tooling out there. There's commercial. Again, I have no skin in this game whatsoever. Attack IQ, Metasploit, Cobalt Strike as examples of some. And then there's some open source stuff like Caldera, OWASP, and others available as well. So again, if you're dabbling, you might as well dabble with Caldera and try it out and see some of the results. Now, it's interesting because when you go through some of this testing, if you prevent and you do your test, you may prevent it earlier on because of a variety of things and never see the exact attack path. Like you don't see the details. And so you may want to run in audit mode so you can see the execution of the full path and track it to see whether or not you are able to detect it. And you may also find that you detect it in different ways than what's suggested by the tool that you're leveraging, right? So what are some of the benefits? Well, you identify vulnerabilities. So simulating attacks against your networks and systems, again, to identify those vulnerabilities and weaknesses in that security posture overall. Highlights what controls detect and prevent and those that fail. Failure is a good thing here, right? Because now you know. And you'd rather have this happen now versus an adversary, right? Testing those controls and seeing those fail. Also helps you prioritize. So if you go back to your 20 minutes left, you're kidding. Oh, no, you were kidding? Started late. Yeah. Anyways, okay, and no. Yeah, so the nice thing about this, though, is when you build it out, you can go to your leaders now with something that's informed. You say, it's not about a next-gen firewall. It's not about an endpoint detection response tool, right? I don't need budget for this. But you can translate this into the gaps that you've identified and the risks to the business. It's a much better conversation. Compliance is also going to help with driving towards this. Again, it's with evidence-based testing that you're able to see the adversaries targeting you and the outcomes. Continuous improvement overall. Obviously, you've been there, done that. It's going to help your overall team's capabilities, training and awareness, simulation of phishing, email, social engineering, and attacks. And I'm going a little bit faster because I want to show you some of the examples. Gather threat intelligence. So as you're going through the process, this is what you're going to do. You're going to gather threat intelligence. You're going to extract those techniques. You're going to analyze and organize. And then you're going to develop tools and then emulate the adversary. That's the ultimate goal. And there's certain things that you're going to do within those steps, right? Determine the adversaries of interest. What verticals that they're targeting? Are they verticals that we fall under? Identify post-exploitation. So do they open a shell or do brute force? Check out the tools and aliases and campaigns the adversary. So there's a little bit of work here that you're going to do. And MITRE ATT&CK's a great tool. It's not the only tool, but a great tool that you can leverage to get this information. And example of that, an adversary group, a wizard spider, and they use software like Emotet as an example. Then you want to extract the techniques, right? Identify the behaviors, collect information. You want to identify the tactics and then move down to the technique and sub-technique that they're leveraging. It's a team effort. We're going to work together on this. And that's an example of the MITRE ATT&CK framework there. This is Navigator. This is a tool that you can use to identify your adversaries and then map this out. You can do it based on rubric scoring and everything else. And then you can overlay this with your defensive capabilities and identify the gaps. You want to understand their objectives, their motivations. And this is an example of it. So this is Wizard Spider as an example. Everything in green is what they do. And if you look, initial access says valid accounts. Persistence says valid accounts. Privilege escalation says valid accounts. Guess what I would do? There's 3 opportunities for the adversary to get credentials of your users and use them for nefarious reasons. If I don't have MFA, I'm probably going to start investing in one, right? Because obviously this is a weakness potentially in the organization. We want to see if there's open source or commercially off-the-shelf tooling. You'll create payload, simulate the attack infrastructure, set up C2, the domains, drive towards their motivations, low and slow, as I mentioned. And it's a collection of both red and blue teams working together. So here's an example. So this one's interesting. This one is, again, you leverage any tool you want, but this is Attack IQ. And what I'm doing here is I'm going through and I'm creating an assessment, okay? Hopefully you guys can see it, but it'll be all up on the thing later too, so you can see it. But I'm going to create a custom scenario. I'm going to give it a name as I go through here, but it's pretty easy. All you do is come in here. You can search the scenarios that they have built into the platform. Just so you know, there's an agent on an endpoint that's going to go through a firepower device as an example and out to the Attack IQ head end, okay? That's how it's going to work. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick, and I picked this on purpose, Cozy Bear, CNC, and it's looking for a specific URI that happens to indicate flash, okay? And so I picked this specifically because there's no signature enabled by default on the default policy within Firepower for this. There could be lots of reasons why, meaning that things have changed since then or whatever. But I picked it because I knew it wasn't available. And so I'm in the platform. Again, use any platform you want. This is powered by Snort, which is open source. And so I can search up Cozy as an example, and I see a couple of signatures there, and I'm just going to enable them for fun, right? Well, not for fun, but if I'm looking at Cozy, I might say, you know what, maybe I want these enabled after I've done some research. Now, you don't want to just enable signatures for the sake of it. I'm not suggesting that. You want to understand what the threat the threat is and understand how it applies to your organization and enable your signatures as required. But the point here is that I'm going to go ahead and enable this, and just based on a little bit of timing, I'm just going to fast forward just a bit here. So I blocked this out. I've enabled it to make sure the rule actually has got that policy as well. So that's fine. I'm going to go to unified events, and then I'm just going to give this a name here. And then once I give it a name, I'm going to grab the endpoint. And the endpoint then is going to go ahead and run this test. It's basically going to go out to a head end with that URI attached to it. And what's going to happen is that it's going to fail, meaning that I didn't prevent the attack, okay? So there is some integration with Attack IQ, but if you want to learn more about that product, you certainly can go to their website. But what I'll find very quickly as I start going live here, and as this attack continues to move through its process, I see that very quickly, I know this because I happen to know the environment pretty well, that flash video is that actual attack, okay? And I didn't identify it. Why? Because I don't have a signature for it. And I thought I wanted to do something a little bit fun with this as well. And so I thought, okay, that's fine. Let me look this up. What is the details around this? And there's a particular URI that's involved, right? It looks for this, for player.swf, right? And there's a full URI path there that I can pull, or a path that's part of the URI, right? It's command and control. So I can grab this, and I thought, wow, what if I went into ChatGPT, right? Because that's the hot new thing today, and asked it to create a snort signature for me for that particular rule. Now, what I can tell you is I'm a big believer. I've had it try to convert scripts over, and it's not been great, like converting to Python, to PowerShell. It's good, but it's not perfect. And same thing with this. So here I had to play with this a bit to get something pretty close. But imagine if you come in here and start creating a bunch of defaults that you knew drove the right signature outcome, but only changed certain elements of that signature. And it's Snort, so it's on a lot of different platforms. So create Snort version 3 signature, following order in one line, alerts, TCP home network, external network. So I know what to ask it. Give it a name or a message, right? CNC server, security vulnerability detected, flow to server, so I want a connection made. URI has no value, content without brackets. I had to tell it that because I did it without the brackets, and I didn't get the result I wanted. So that's that right down here at the bottom here, that's that web script security view player, blah, 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 right? That's what I want to create the detection for, and I want to run it against that, okay? So that's the signature. And then I dumped it in here, and I thought, well, wait a minute, what if I'm new to Snort and I don't even know it? Why don't I just ask it to tell me exactly how it created it and what each element is? I thought this was pretty neat. So I said to it, explain each line item in detail for me. Because I'm new, I'm learning, I want to know more about it, right? And now I'm starting to get a skill set maybe that I didn't have, and in my opinion, maybe even accelerate that skill set. And now it's say, okay, well, alert TCP, home net versus external net, right? Here's your ports, here's the message, flow to server. So it's teaching me how it created that signature and what each element in that signature means. Pretty cool, at least I thought. Anyways, so I went through that, and I copy it from here. And I had to make a small adjustment, so it still wasn't perfect. And I didn't play with it any longer because all I wanted to do was give the point out there that there's lots of tools to drive an outcome, especially when you're doing a breach simulation or attack simulation. So I come in and I import it into the engine. And then I'm going to set it to block. And I'm going to go ahead and test it after I do a deploy. And I'll rerun that test. Now, hopefully it stops it, but it won't stop it because I'm actually running in IDS mode in this case. So let's see what happens here. We'll refresh, we're running the test, and we should see something here. any second now. It's a video. It should be with, oh, there we go. Okay, so there it sees it would have dropped. So it knows that it's in IDS mode, so it's clearly stated that it would have blocked this if you were in prevention mode, but it did alert on it regardless. And there's all the parameters that we just created. So one quick, easy way to test something like CNC. Pretty basic, right? But it's part of the attack framework, and I can evaluate that. And again, depending on the tooling, there might be MITRE tags that are associated with the alerting, yada, 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 right? So a good way of start testing the environment. And then you can drill into packets, again, depending on the technology stack that you might have in play. So the next one, I thought, well, wait a minute. Why don't I do this one? Again, use any endpoint that you have to drive the outcome. Natively, Windows Defenders, I have to disable it. I'm in audit mode. If you go into audit mode, then Defender's smart enough to actually turn itself back on after you've disabled it. I thought that was pretty cool. But anyway, so I'm in Caldera, so this might be familiar to you. And I'm searching up Mimikatz as an example. And again, this will have an agent deployed on the inside. It does have a client that understands detection and response or EDR capabilities. And it's in audit mode as well. So it's not going to prevent anything. And so I can come in here. You can build these based on operations. You can build these very elaborate. Like everything an adversary is going to do, you could have listed here. So give it a name. I'm going to start that new operation. There is no adversary that we're leveraging. And we'll go into advanced. And there's a bunch of stuff that you can do in here. But I left all the defaults. I left it and I didn't do any obfuscation or anything like that. And I'm going to grab that technique, and I'm going to run that technique around Mimikatz. So again, I could look for specific tactics or techniques that I want to flag. Here, I'm just going to be lazy and search for it. So Mimikatz, and then there's a whole bunch down here. I'm going to grab one. And, you know, now that I think about it, I picked proc as the default, I guess, shell within. I could have picked PowerShell, most likely, especially that it is power, but it doesn't matter. In this case, it detected it. But you might have to tweak it is my point. And I go ahead and run it, okay? Now, if I quickly run to endpoint, I can see the policy update that I just forced. And if I hit reload, I can start seeing stuff coming in. So the first thing I see is command reference remote red team tools. Another refresh from there. And now I can see at the very top, Mimikatz dump credentials. But if I go back through the process, I start seeing multiple different tactics. Actually more than what the test was in itself. And why? Because it looks at the attack tool, the ingress tool transfer, anything like that is happening outside of that is also being tracked, which is now showing me more things than maybe my initial test. Command and control, resource development, ingress tool transfer. And again, hopefully the tool, whatever you use, gives you, clear understanding of those capabilities of the platform. And it also includes the script that may have ran in the environment. You certainly want that as well. And then as I go up a little bit higher, it says Mimikatz is an open source offensive tool designed for credentials and memory, blah, 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 right? And then it says credential access, that's the tactic. And then you've got two techniques that were discovered here, OS credential dumping, LSAS memory. That's the test that I think we were doing. And then also this use alternate as well, right? So pass the hash as an example. Now, the one thing that I did was, okay, well, wait a minute. I'm going to do automatic isolation of this asset. And again, this is understanding not only the adversary's abilities, but what is the defensive outcome of this as well in the equation. So I'm going to set this to critical. Anything that's a critical alert of a certain group, this group is going to be the group in protect mode. So we're going to protect in this case, and I'm going to save. And so basically what I'm saying is if you see a critical event trigger, not only for MITRE, but for anything, automatically isolate the machine and hopefully reduce the risk to the organization ultimately, right? That's the goal. And so what I'll say to the red teams is, I'm doing a ping here to 8.8.8, and I said, red team, go ahead and run your test again. Let's just see the difference. Now I see all the tactics and techniques that we would discover with that test, which is great. But now I want to identify whether or not I had the ability to stop it and what that outcome would look like. So here, all I'm doing is moving it from audit. I'm showing you every step, right? So there's no smoke and mirrors, right? I'm going through and I'm moving this into the protect policy. And I'm going to update. I'm going to force it. It would just update after a few, 30 seconds, 60 seconds, depending. When it got the last update, and it moved over. The test I'm going to run here. So I'll go ahead and add a potential link, a new test, all brand new. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll do the search for Mimi Cats. And we'll scroll down. And here we go. We'll grab that one. That's the command line. We'll add it. It's automatically running because it's set in the policy. It's automatically running. And what's happening here is you can see, oh no. Let me go back. Sorry, I'll be quick. So what you can see is here, it's not isolated, right? And then a few seconds after we did this, you can see right here, this will turn to, see it says isolated. So I hit the wrong button by accident. But anyways, so now it's isolated, but I can still ping 8.8.8. So you might be saying, well, wait a minute, how are you You're still pinging. It started isolation. Well, because I have a whitelist for 8.8.8 in my policy. So with anything, you might still want access to certain systems, even in the event that you need to isolate an asset. That's the point here, right? And then I go ahead and show you that I can't ping 1.1.1. I can't even ping the local gateway on the network. That's the 255.1. You can see it's so I am isolated and contained, but for whatever reason, I needed access to 8.8.8 or a specific system, right? And so I can grant that access. The last one here is interesting. I thought, well, let's use the network. We're almost done, Harv. I'm going to get you back on track almost. But anyways, I thought, well, wait a minute. Why don't I use ChatGPT? I'll make the 5 minutes. To create a PowerShell script to scan the network like Nmap. Now, yes, I could have downloaded anything already. I didn't have to do that. But it went through and it starts developing it. Says, okay, for major ports on your network, 192.168.255.0, here's my PowerShell script. And you know me, if I don't know what it's doing, I'm also telling it, please explain every single step that you created because I want to also understand and become very proficient at this as well. So what is this? What is this an example of if I'm using PowerShell to scan the network? Anybody want to throw out? What? Sorry, I can't hear you. It is Nmap. Yeah, it's like Nmap, right? We're scanning the network. It is living off the land, right? I'm not bringing in any tooling, not bringing in anything extra, right? And I'm an adversary that's maybe not as skilled on the scripting side. So again, this is just to show you how easy it could be. So I go ahead and I copy this. Is this perfect code? It's not. It's really close though. And so I throw it into Windows PowerShell ICE and I hit, select all and I hit play and failure. But you know what? It points me to exactly where the failure is. I had to add the parentheses, right? The brackets between IP and port. That's it. So I do that. And again, just trying to be sensitive of time here. I do that and then I rerun it, okay? And I not only rerun it within the ICE Pro, there's no client on this, by the way, enabled at this point. So I'm not looking to do this from an endpoint detection response. I'm not looking to do this from a next-gen firewall perspective, and I hate the next-gen term, but don't get me started on that. So I don't start it on either one of those. So what I'm leveraging here with a little bit of time is the network. Can the network detect it? And this is my point, is that I have the ability to test all of my tooling throughout. And so did it test it? Did it detect it? Yes, it did. Maybe it didn't cross a gateway, right? And then NGFW to detect it. Maybe it's on a layer 2 boundary. Maybe you don't have, maybe it's on a camera that doesn't have an endpoint. Can I detect it? Yes, I can. I see the discovery. It talks a little bit about it. I can pivot into the MITRE ATT&CK framework again. You leverage the tools that you have in your organization to do this. But the point here is if my other controls failed, for them to get to this point, I still had another opportunity to detect them in the environment. And you might be saying, well, you didn't prevent it. Yeah, I haven't, but now I know they're there. So now I can start working on prevention. So in summary, defensive is definitely tough business, right? It is really tough business. And we always feel that we're behind the 8 ball. But, collectively, things like BSides, people coming together, we start elevating our defensive knowledge and understanding. I think we're all going to be better off. We want to climb higher in that stack. Think pyramid of pain. Let's see how much pain we can invoke on the adversary by making it very difficult or costly for them to be successful. We want to understand the adversary, right? That's targeting legal, healthcare. You may not care about that they're targeting an operational environment somewhere in Saudi Arabia. It might have no relevance to you. And you might say, well, it's still interesting because they might use some of that in my environment. Yes, but you better do the other things first, right? You better understand who's targeting your vertical first. And then you can go and, if you're at that level, let me know. I'd love to see what that environment looks like, right? But we're not there. Identify the tactics, the what, and the techniques, the how, right? They're driving towards an outcome. Breach attack simulation helps identify your defensive posture and how you stand up against those attacks. Insight into preventative and defensive capabilities. Again, I'm going to reiterate, you're never going to prevent 100% of everything. Even if the tooling has a capability to suggest it can, it will never do it 100% of the time for the rest of the time, right? So you want to make sure you have detection capabilities throughout. Whew. Thanks for the auction style presentation, Harv. But thanks. I know it's lunch, so I don't want to keep anybody from lunch, but anybody want to stick around and chat, I'm more than happy to have any questions, feel free.